about evolution. Evolution as a process and a result as well. And we talked about the modern theory of evolution, the observations and the deductions made by Darwin himself, and we talked about the concept, okay? So in very simple terms, you can explain this theory. So this theory implies the survival of the fittest, where fitness refers to ability to survive and reproduce better. Organisms that are better fit in their environment will survive better and reproduce better, and their traits that are ideal for those environments, will be passed on and will be enriched in the population. We even talked about some traits that can be, in a way, detrimental to an organism's health, but they could somehow confer an advantage in a particular environment, for instance, where a pathogen is present. So we talk about these concepts. We don't talk about necessarily good or bad characters, good or bad genes. We just talk about best characters, best genes, best traits for a particular environment. Okay? Everything is related to the environment. So the theory introduced by Darwin is a theory of evolution by natural selection, where the environment determines a selection of those individuals that have the best adaptations for that particular environment. They are fittest for that environment. So we talk about all these, and we also talk about a special case of natural selection, which is known as sexual selection. And we watched a couple of videos, right? We watched a funny video about Bird of Paradise, and we watched a video of an experiment, really, that's been done with peacocks. Anybody remembers that experiment? What was the conclusion of that experiment, what they did?
They were clipping their feathers to see, like, if they'd be more attractive if they had less feathers or more.
And what happened when they cut the tails of the ones that had very nice, less attractive? And what else they gathered from the very most important piece of information they gathered from this experiment?
The ones that had the naturally big ones had better offspring.
Okay, the peacocks that had these huge tails, in fact, were the ones that produced the offspring that survived better. So there is an association between survival and the length, the complexity, we can say, of the tail. And so we're still in a case of natural selection, but that acts through sexual selection. Okay, so it's just a particular case. Okay, and again, remember that this is not about the survival of the single individual. If the single individual that carries this longer tail may be predated, may be slowed down when it's running away from a predator, the fact that produces an offspring that is more likely to survive is more important. So it's the survival of the species that is more important than the survival of the single individual. Okay? And that's always the case. I think we stopped here, right? We didn't talk about artificial selection. So just wanted to make sure you understand what artificial selection means. This is a very, very different concept than natural selection. So far we talked about natural selection. Artificial selection is a purposeful breeding of organisms that have traits that are selected by us, by humans. It has nothing to do with natural selection or traits that confer better ability to the species to survive better. There are traits that are convenient for us, We have been doing this for a long time with crops, okay? Crops that produce more bigger plants, bigger vegetables. We have been doing this also with, a lot with the dogs, right? We have artificially selected breeds of dogs. Many times, actually, we have selected for characters that we liked. We just liked because they were nice to us. And along with those, we have also brought some very detrimental characters to some breeds of dogs. So, again, artificial selection is a very different concept than natural selection. Told you about the breeds of dogs. If you research it, there are some breeds of dogs that have malformations, really, because there are some genes that, when genes are associated, are very close on a chromosome. If you're selected for one gene, you're also carrying the other with it. So that's what we have been doing for some breeds of dogs, ending up with, yes, the desired characters, maybe the color of the hair or the pointy ears, something like that. But we have brought with those characters maybe some very detrimental malformations in some breeds of dogs. So again, to summarize, what's important to study evolution, we learned this at the very beginning. Of course, understanding evolution means also being able to predict maybe how pathogens are evolving, and not only living organisms, but also viruses, for instance. Remember, viruses do have genetic material. They have the same exact genetic material that we have. And so understanding how mutations can happen, the rapidity at which they can happen, or what mutate, in which direction they can go, we can also maybe intervene with production of new vaccines, maybe before we can be faster than that pathogen, in other words. Before the pathogen mutates, we can already have the vaccine ready for it. So definitely very important for also the health, for a health field. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about is the 5 types of evidence of evolution that we have in our hands. So again, we learned about Darwin, we learned about his voyage. He collected mostly fossil evidence, and he also referred to comparative biogeography. We'll talk about biogeography and the questions that he asked during his voyage. He was puzzled by some facts, but eventually everything came together, especially when he learned about Lyell's published book, The Principles of Geology. Remember, they talked about this movement of Earth's crust. Things are starting to make sense to him at some point. Okay, so these are the 5 types of evidence of evolution that we can talk about. Later today, in about probably 20 minutes, we're going to start talking about fossils specifically. So I'm going to just introduce this, and we'll go in detail in the explanation of fossil formation. So fossils can preserve in different types of substrates, as we will see, from mud to quicksand, asphalt, waterborne sediments, lava flows, but also in things like under permafrost. And there are some environments, we'll talk about peat bogs, which are very acidic, very, very special environments. They can preserve bodies almost like intact for many, many hundreds of years, thousands of years, as we will see. Okay, so a fossil is any evidence of past life, but there are also fossils. We also find fossils of organisms that are still living. Has anybody ever heard about coelacanth? A coelacanth? We'll talk about this so-called living fossil. It's amazing. is a fish that, and several species of fish that belong to this group, Silica, that we thought they were extinct. Or we found lots of fossils from hundreds of millions, of years ago, and we thought it was extinct until 1974, I believe, was when it was actually found alive. So that's why it's been named since then the living fossil. Anyways, yeah, we find fossil evidence of even organisms that are still living. Most of them are extinct. So fossil evidence include chemical evidence, body parts, and traces of any impressions, as we will see. We're going to talk about this, as I said, in just a little bit. So I have a few questions for you. Okay, so fossil is the strongest evidence, if you will. You cannot deny a fossil that is in front of your eyes. You really cannot say it does not exist. It's very hard proof that there have, in fact, been creatures on Earth that are intermediate between some forms and others. And therefore, this is an indication of a change over time, evolution. Second type of evidence, DNA. We have talked about this, remember? We can sequence nowadays entire genome. The genome is all the DNA, all the genes of an organism. We call it genome. So we can sequence genomes of species in a matter of hours nowadays, and we can compare, therefore, their sequences. And of course, as you would expect, the more mutations, the more changes are in between two different species, the more time has occurred between the two. So the more distant they are. Of course, because the more time occurs, the more mutations will accumulate over time. You can understand this is intuitive. And so by looking at how many mutations there are in specific genes, remember there are genes that we share, even with bacteria. Okay, what a better evidence. But just the fact that our genetic material is same exact genetic material as bacteria tells you that in fact we were bacteria to begin with. So by comparing same genes in different organs and how many mutations have occurred in between, we can really infer the time that has occurred between the two, these two species, or if we're considering two broader groups. At the end of this course, we're going to talk about the so-called molecular clock, which is the technique that uses this knowledge to infer the time that has occurred between the divergence of two groups. Okay, I already told you all this. Don't worry about this slide. Actually, I meant to hide it. Okay, but later on in the course, we'll talk about how we have understood which group is closer to humans between chimps and gorillas. For a long time, there was a debate. This has been resolved with DNA analysis of specific sequences. We'll talk about those sequences later on. Again, by looking at many mutations, how many more mutations between humans and gorillas versus humans and chimps. Third type of evidence, comparative anatomy. So this is the methodology that has been historically used to construct phylogenetic trees, right? We have been looking at anatomy of structures to understand if really the two structures are very similar or not, and therefore to infer common ancestry. For instance, let's look at a limb of a human, limb of a cat, lip of a whale, and the wing of a bat. If you zoom in and you look at the bone structures, first of all, there are bone structures in there, okay? If you were to include in this comparison the wing of a butterfly, would you find bones in that wing? Not at all. So the fact that you find bones, that's one thing, it already tells you same type of structure, same material. But then when you zoom in a little more, and here it's easy, they're all highlighted the same color, the same bones. In each of these structures, you find the same exact set of bones, okay? You must have heard about humerus in your body, right? Radius ulna, who has ever broken their arm and maybe went to the doctor and say you have a fracture in your radius ulna, okay? And so these are bones that we find in our arm, okay? We find the same exact bone in limb of a cat, the same exact bones in the flip of a whale. Now, of course, the bone can shrink in size or can become even longer or thinner. It doesn't matter. It's the same bone. The experts know it, okay? And again, the same exact sets of bones. The phalanges here in the whale have become really long. Same thing in the wing of a bat. Same exact sets of bones as humans. Now here as well, the metacarpal and the phalanges have become very thin and long, but there's still those bones, okay? So we know by comparing these structures, find the same exact sets of bones, that these organs are very related to one another. In fact, these are all vertebrates. There must be a common ancestor from which all these structures have evolved. So, whenever we are in a situation like this where we recognize close common ancestry in structures that we're analyzing, in this case as a forelimb, but it could be something else, we talk about homology, okay? Homologous structures, because there is common ancestry. Now, as I told you, if we were including here wings of a butterfly, wings of butterfly are the same, in terms of use, are the same structures as the wing of a bat. There are still structures that are used to lift in flight. But you won't recognize any homology between the wing of a bat and the wing of a butterfly. No sets of bones, and even the tissue is very different there. So in that case, you know that you are in front of analogous analogy. There is analogy between structures, so structures are said to be analogous, but not homologous. There is no common ancestry there. Okay? So these are the terms that we utilize in comparative anatomy. Okay? So these are homologous structures, as I told you. And today, at the end of this lecture, we're going to watch one of the most interesting videos of this course, in my opinion, to understand the origin, evolution of whales. Evidence number 4, type of evidence number 4, comparative embryology. If you take a human embryo, first couple of weeks of development, and you bring to an expert embryologist and say, which embryo is this, which species, which group at least, they won't be able to tell you. It could tell you it's anywhere from a fish to an amphibian to a reptile to a mammal. So there is this phenomenon that we observe where all embryos of vertebrates basically are pretty much identical at the very beginning. So identical, so much so that in a human embryo, at the very beginning of embryonic development, you can recognize gill structures. Okay? And so it seems like, in a way, during the steps of embryonic development, we are recapitulating the steps of evolution. We were fish. We come from fish. Okay, and we looked at vertebrate, remember the vertebrate cladogram that I showed you, the common ancestor, okay, of vertebrates originate in water, then they become terrestrial. So you first are fish, then you become a tetrapod. And can you become, from a tetrapod, can you go back to a fish-like creature? Yes, you can, absolutely. Evolution has no limits. If the structure, if the environment puts a pressure from my species, for some reason, to acquire a fish-like body, it will happen, okay? It's all about the environment, and that's exactly what has happened to whales, as we will see. It's so fascinating. You can go back and forth in evolution, okay? This phenomenon that I'm telling you about is expressed with this sentence. Don't get scared. It's not difficult. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. We know what phylogeny is, right? Phylogeny is what? The history of evolution of a group. It tells us what is the history there. It tells me phylogeny, tells me that I was a fish, right? At some point, to begin with, I was a fish. The group of vertebrates started that way. Ontogeny is just the embryonic development. So the embryonic development recapitulates the stages of evolution and tells us a history there, right there. It's so evident in front of us. Why would I have gills as an embryo if I wasn't in fact a fish so many millions of years ago? Okay? Of course, those gills become different structure. They transport during the embryonic development and become support for our respiratory airways. Okay. Of course, if you compare a human embryo with embryo of a plant, plants also have embryos, you will not find any possible common structure there, okay? Because there is no connection there. Okay, so again, you will find only the groups that have common ancestry having similarities during embryonic development. Now, a plant with an animal in general. Okay, these are just examples of some embryos. These are a little bit more advanced than what I showed you before. There's a little bit of difference here. If you go a little bit earlier, you will find situation like this, very, very similar. Okay, almost identical. Even experts may not be able to recognize who is who. This is to me the most fascinating thing. How can I be a fish as an embryo and then slowly become a mammal during my embryonic development? This is a strong evidence that evolution has happened. Okay, fifth type of evidence, biogeography. Now we talked about the voyage that Darwin underwent, and he found amazing things. He got a picture that nobody had ever got before. He saw fossils of gigantic sloths that are not existing anymore, and especially in the Galapagos island where we found all these finches. Remember we talked about. He didn't understand at that time. He was puzzled because this was his first question. Why similar habitats? Because he had been in places that have very similar climate near the equator. So, but in each place where he arrived, there were different species there. And so he got the picture there that evolution is very univoc to the place where it happens. It's not that because in this place on Earth I have exact same climate as this place, I'll let the same exact species evolve there. No, find all different species. Okay, so he kind of like knew the answer to this question. He knew that evolution is univoc, but he was puzzled by another observation because I'm just gonna fast forward. He also found fossils or living creatures, fossils of the same exact extinct species in two different continents that were separated by ocean, or very similar species in different continents. So his other question, he was puzzled because he understood that evolution is a kind of like related to really the place where it happens, but at the same time he found this situation. What's the answer to this question? How could he find fossil of the same identical creature in two different continents if evolution happens differently in different places? How can this happen?
Everything was together and then separate.
Pangea. So he was Pangea, sorry. He was enlightened by, remember that book from Plios that he was reading, that was talking about the movements of Earth. So everything was coming together finally to explain how this phenomenon that he observed could have happened. So it's because at one point there was one land, so it was just split up. And that's why you find the same species. Otherwise, you wouldn't not find the same species in such different places. All right, so, and one other thing I want to make sure you guys understand is when we talk about evolution, evolution is not necessarily progress. It's not becoming better. It's becoming better adapted. Okay? Again, I may be boring. I may be repeating the same thing over and over, but this is important. I do see students still express misconceptions in their tests. So there is no becoming better in an absolute sense of the word. It's becoming better adapted. Okay? We can mention examples where better adapted means having an anemia. Is it being better? It's being better adapted, okay, to the environment where a certain pathogen is present. Now, the one thing I want to make sure you guys avoid is being teleological, especially when you express the concept of evolution by natural selection. Teleology is the philosophical view that attributes cause or purpose to things, living things or natural phenomenon. So let's give examples. This sentence says, bacteria became resistant to antibiotics in order to survive. Seems like bacteria purposely, for some, by some special force that they have, became resistant to the antibiotics to survive. This is a teleological statement. How can we restate this sentence and explain the phenomenon of natural selection that may have happened, in fact, for bacteria to acquire over time that resistance? Any volunteers? Should I use the magic baggie? If I don't have a volunteer, I will. We're trying, remember here, we're trying to just reformulate this sentence and capturing the concept of evolution by natural selection in it. That's it. So this could be something that is in the test, okay? But again, I see many students that they say, bacteria became resistant to antibiotics, so they could survive better. Somehow that they would reformulate the sentence, but just changing a few words, but leaving the teleological meaning to it, underlying meaning. Do you want to try?
Over time, bacteria mutated to became more resistant to antibiotics.
Yeah, that's much better. He says, over time, bacteria mutated and became more resistant to antibiotics. In a more comprehensive way, you can say when we started applying antibiotics to treat infections, bacterial infections, some bacteria had mutations, pre-existing mutations that conferred resistance. So we killed all the bacteria that were not resistant because they had the right mutation, and and only the bacteria that had those mutations survived and reproduced, and produced populations of bacteria that were resistant. You know, we are nowadays experiencing this resistance. You know, we are finding more difficult to fight some infections because there is a lot of resistance nowadays in bacterial strain. Antibiotic was invented in World War II. During World War II, penicillin, right? It's the first antibiotic. We'll talk about that. And since the beginning, at the beginning it was working beautifully. It was, all the soldiers who were getting injured, they could fight infections very well. Nowadays, whenever you get an infection, they have to test which antibiotic you could use. Usually they do a test to see which one works, because there are so many strains of bacteria out there nowadays that are being selected to be resistant by the antibiotics themselves that we have introduced in the environment. Okay, so this is a very minimalistic sentence, very, very minimalistic, okay? I would like much more from you, okay, to give a more comprehensive concept. Bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. So this implies there is a mutation, pre-existing mutation before you apply the antibiotic, right? Survive better than bacteria that are not. Okay, another one. Dolphins develop echolocation in order to find their prey more easily. Naira? Nija? Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
No.
Why you don't correct me?
Sorry.
Dia.
Dina.
Deya. Oh, Deya. Oh, I'm so off. Okay. Deya. You have a little bit of time to think. What is your last name? Okay, Farnes.
Oh, Burns.
Okay. So what do you think? Do you think this is a teleological sentence? What? Do you think this is it seems like a teleological sentence to you or not?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, because it's attributing a willingness to dolphins to evolve this echolocation when we know that's not the case.
Yeah.
So how would you resent?
How would you reword it?
Reward it, yeah.
Echolocation has helped dolphins to find their prey easier.
Yeah, that's much better for sure. She says echolocation has helped dolphins find their prey more easily, therefore survive better and transmit their that trait to the offspring, so that echolocation has become a trait. Okay? That's pretty much what this one says, right? Okay, so again, it's not difficult, okay? You just have to rephrase it in terms of what you have learned about natural selection, okay? All right, this is the video. Please pay attention and remember that videos, concepts expressed in videos can be very well questions in the test. So it's not that the video is just a moment to relax. You have to pay very good attention to videos. And this video is very, very important. And it's narrated by the expert, the very expert who studies these things.
How do we know evolution happens?
Fossils provide the most interesting evidence for evolution, and certainly the most powerful for most people.
I want you to look behind them.
There's an abundance of hard evidence at the molecular, chemical, and anatomical level that evolution happens. But perhaps it's the clues hardened in stone that tell evolution's story most vividly.
Here are the backbones. You can see how big these vertebrae are.
The history of life is all a record in fossils, millions of them, from strata, layer by layer by layer back through time, are all interconnected. Now, partly this layering and succession is how we tell time in geology, but it's also the principal evidence that life has changed through time, that life has evolved through time, that the things living today can all be connected back through time to common ancestors.
These now lifeless dry rocks are gold to paleontologists. They are the puzzle pieces to the origin of one of the most powerful and majestic animals on Earth, the whale.
The evolution of whales has always been sort of a mystery. They're like us in that they're very intelligent. They're mammals. They're warm-blooded. They nurse young and feed them milk. But they're very, very different. I mean, they live in water. They can hear in water. And they swim around like fish. So the question is this. We know that mammals originally evolved on land, yet whales live in the water. How did that shift, how did that evolution happen from life on land to life in the water?
That question consumes paleontologist Phil Gingrich. The evolution of whales has been his passion ever since 1978, when his team unearthed a rock in Pakistan that appeared to have a skull embedded in it.
When we found it, all you could see was the brain case. But I thought it was a wolf-like animal with a very small brain. When it was cleaned, the ears were uncovered, and I could see that it had a very characteristic whale ear, and that shows us that what we have is a whale, not a wolf, not a deer, not some other kind of mammal, but the fossil whale.
Gingrich named the whale ancestor Pakicetus. With only its skull as evidence, scientists do not know for sure what the rest of Pakicetus looked like. But some scientists hypothesize that it resembled a modern seal.
Okay, look at this, Bill. Here's this.
Paleontologists look for fossils that have transitional features from one way of life to another. They use these related forms to create a comprehensive picture of evolutionary change. When fossils of related species are located, scientists organize them by their physical similarities. Sometimes these similarities don't evolve all at once, like the whale ear of Pakicetus, which lacks many other whale-like features in its backbone and limbs.
Whales' bodies contain inside them connections or clues to their past. I mean, their mammalian traits are signs of their recent history, but they're also signs of a very ancient history. Take their flippers. On the outside, their flippers look like fish fins, but on the inside, the bones of that flipper are very similar to those in a monkey's arm, in the wing of a bird, and in the limb of a frog.
Egypt today seems an unlikely place for Phil Gingrich to find intermediate whale fossils.
This is Wales Valley in Egypt. You can see behind me there are many hills of sandstone standing above shale. What's important, it's called Valley of Whales because there are about 400 skeletons of whales weathering out here.
Whales in the desert? What can that be? More specifically?
Continental drift. Continental drift.
Right, but what was there before in that desert? There was ocean, right?
This was a wide open blue sea with a full range of sea life living in it. A lot of invertebrate shellfish, sharks, about 5 or 6 kinds of whales living here.
Gingrich searches for intermediates with hind limbs and feet to trace back until those feet and hind limbs are as big and fully functional as any 4-footed animal that lives on land.
It is a Basilosaurus. Look at this. Here's the skull, incisors up front, the rest of the teeth come back to here, and then the whole length of the skull is over a meter.
His find, Basilosaurus, had tiny hind legs with a mobile knee and several toes, and lived 35 to 41 million years ago. Here's where scientists place this transitional form on the fossil record. The discovery of another fossil has led scientists to conclude that whales evolved from a land mammal much like this one, called Sononyx. Perhaps its descendants found the water a source of abundant food and a haven from competition. Over millions of years, through variation and selection, front legs became fins, rear legs disappeared, bodies lost fur, and took on their familiar streamlined shape.
Whales show us the sheer creative power of evolution. I mean, from a wolf-like creature to a whale in 10 or so million years is amazing.
Each dig and discovery adds more stone, more bone, more hard evidence for evolution, for the origin of life, for its history here on Earth, and for the evolutionary relationships among all forms of life.
Okay, so, and a tetrapod becomes fish-like creature over the course of millions of years because of selection from the environment? Yes, absolutely it can. Okay? All right, so we are done with this chapter of evolution, and we're gonna now start a new chapter of What the Rocks Say, where we basically are talking about fossils. So this is the last chapter before test, remember? So we're going to look halfway through this lecture, and then we're going to finish this lecture on Wednesday. And then on Wednesday we'll do a review of, all this unit, first unit, which could help you remember things for the exam. Which exam is on the 17th, right? Monday the 17th, so next Monday. All right, so we just talked about fossils a little bit ago. Fossil is any evidence of past life and includes chemical evidence, body parts, traces, and impressions. The first chemical evidence, the first type, the chemical evidence, I want you to tell me what that is. I don't have it in my slides. What's the fossil chemical evidence we have on Earth?
Would it be like some kind of crude oil?
Oil. Where does oil come from? Oil comes from, everybody says dinosaurs, it was like a little bit before then, and it's mostly actually coming from gigantic swampy forests, not much from animals, so mostly from plants. During an era, during the history of life on Earth, the Carboniferous era, Earth was dominated by this swampy forest with gigantic trees, meters and meters and meters tall. For some reason, at some point, this forest all over Earth collapsed. And at that time, we think there were no decomposers on Earth just yet. They had not evolved yet. And therefore, all these gigantic organisms ended up at a certain pressure and temperature underground and transformed slowly over the course of millions of years in this black, concentrated, super concentrated organic matter that we use nowadays as fossil fuel, right? So that's the chemical evidence. It doesn't have a shape anymore, right? It's liquid, but it is fossil evidence, okay? Of past life. All right, so we're gonna talk about body parts, how they form, traces and impressions as well. Okay, so as I told you, fossil preservation can occur in many types of substrates. Mud, quicksand, asphalt, volcanic ash is a very good one. Lava flows, waterborne sediments. And we will understand in which kind of environments actually is more likely a fossil to form. Other types of substrates are, for instance, amber, permafrost, and some kind of regions, such as arid regions or peat bogs. Talking about peat bogs, this is an interesting one, okay? It's just very interesting to talk about. Peat bogs are very acidic environments. There are regions in Europe that are this kind of characteristic. And just to let you understand, this body represented in this picture was actually uncovered in 1950 by just two people that were excavating. I'm not sure why they were excavating in Denmark. And they found this body. They called the police because they thought that this person had been recently killed because the body is so well preserved, the skin is still there. Just to find out, this body is being dated to before Christ, some like 300 before Christ. What happened to this guy? How did he die? Interesting.
Asphyxiation. Asphyxiation.
What's around his neck? He was hung, right? Yeah. At that time, people were hung for any kind of reason. Either they were guilty or not. They were very easily hung. So even that preserved. And to give you an idea of how, this kind of environment can preserve bodies very, very well. There is a video here about peat moss. I'm not going to show it to you, but you can watch videos, kind of interesting, on your own, if you like. Okay, so talking about fossil formation, fossil formation, as you can imagine, is very rare. It doesn't happen all the time. There have to be the right conditions there. Plus, the organism that dies must avoid being devoured or decomposed. It must have enough time in order for that process to happen. And most organisms, when they die, they're devoured or decomposed. So very few organisms that have ever lived are fossilized. Okay? And of course, it's even more difficult to find them. Of course, we know there are many more fossils out there than what we have found. So as you can imagine, we only have a very, very fragmented picture in front of us of how many creatures have really lived on Earth. So we can just, from what we have found, we can just estimate how many species could have lived on Earth, but it's a huge number. It's a huge number. Okay, now, the one thing you really have to know is this, that it's a little bit counterintuitive. Fossils form much better, much more likely in water or muddy environments than in dry environments. Okay, does not mean they don't form at all in dry environments, but if you will, this is an intrinsic bias because we find many more fossils of creatures that have lived in water than creatures that are terrestrial, strictly terrestrial. So this is one of the very important things about fossil formation. The other, the reason why the fossil formation is favored in water is because the decomposition process is slower in water, and therefore there's more chance for a fossil to form. The other intrinsic bias of fossil formation is, as you can imagine, the fact that if an organism has hard structures, bones or shells, those structures are more likely to fossilize than soft tissues. Okay, so that's the second intrinsic bias of fossil. We find many more fossil organisms that have some kind of shell or bones than organisms that didn't. So it's another bias. Nonetheless, it's possible that organisms that didn't have any solid structures, they can still fossilize. This is, for instance, a fossil of a jellyfish. Okay, it can still happen, but it's much more rare. Okay, so regarding now the types of fossils and how they can form. The first type of fossil formation that we can recognize is known as mineralization. The word itself tells you something. So when I find, when that guy was finding those bones of whales in the video, and I find this kind of fossil remains, and I pick it up and I touch it. What am I touching? Am I touching the bone? I'm not touching the cells or the organic material which the bones once were made of. Where I am touching is a stone. Is a piece of stone in the shape of that structure. So, along the course of millions of years, very slowly, what happens is that all the organic material has been exchanged with the minerals of the rock. Very, very slowly. And therefore, during this process known as mineralization, you end up with a shape, an original shape as it was, but made of pure rock. This is a rock, in fact, in the shape of that structure. Okay? Second important type of fossil formation is formation of mold and casts, which are shown there. So basically, whenever you have the formation of a cast, you can recognize a mold to it. So this is a different process than mineralization, because what has happened here is that wherever there was that organism, somehow there was a space, the organism has disappeared. But it has disappeared slowly. All the structures have slowly disappeared, leaving behind a space. And that space then was subsequently filled up with a specific rock. And therefore, you end up with a cast and a mold. Anybody has ever seen this picture? That is where I come from. I live next town from Pompeii. So I'm very acquainted with these pictures here. These are people you have images here, not images, you have fossils of people, basically they died because of the gases that they were released from the volcano, nearby volcano that exploded. And so they're trying to protect their children, themselves, and they were immobilized in that shape because then the volcanic ashes deposited on the bodies. Okay? And slowly, this is an example of formation of cast. Okay? And then we have uncovered them so many thousands of years later. All right, so this is the second fossil type of fossil formation. Third, and this is, and sorry. So I have some examples here. I would like you guys to kind of pass around. This is a trilobite. This is a very common, one of the most common type of fossil that you can find around. These are also and we'll talk about trilobites later on in the course. Here we go. I have collected these ones, the small ones. The other day there was a Darwin Day at Austin Community College on Eastview campus, and we went there. There were so many activities. My bad, I should have told you guys about that event. There is every year, there is this day that is known as Darwin Day, that is organized by NCC, and you can go there and listen to talks. And then there are activities. For instance, you can look at the microscope. There is fossil digging, things like that. More for kids, if you will, but why not? Also for adults. My 10-year-old and I were fighting over a microscope to look at the protists. I have got a sample of protists. Kind of stole it. So maybe we can. I asked permission. I said, okay, maybe I can take a little bit of this, right? We can look at protists at the microscope this year. After the exam, we can start that chapter. Anyways, sorry for the little deviation. So trilobites were very, very common in an era or a period of time known as Cambrian period. We will study that period and what happened. There was an explosion of life on Earth. These are some of the first organisms to appear. Okay, so mold and cast. Third type of fossil formation are trace fossils. As the word says, the name says, these are not remains of organisms or remains of shape of an organism that was there, like in the case of mineralization and cast. This is the remain of an activity that tells you the organisms passed by there. For instance, these are channels that were burrowed by some worms. They're not the worms that died there, okay? So the remain of the activity, the burrowing, is there, as well as also that one on top, this one, just remains of activity. So there is a footprint that is left behind and tells you that by their place some organisms passed by. So these are trace fossils. What is this? What do we call it more scientifically? Come on, don't even use the word poop on the test. I'm going to take a point. Okay. This is fecal matter, okay? So, yes, I've had students who use that word. Okay, here in college, remember. So, yes, even that can fossilize and can be informative. The experts can look at the color, composition, and we can learn about the diet of an organism. If there is a fossil nearby, most likely comes from that. So, or sometimes we can find some structures inside, some species, such as a tooth in the body of another organism, fossilized there. We know there was predation. Okay, all these kind of like tells us about organisms' behavior, species behavior. Okay. So, there is a video here. Please don't talk about the movie. Anybody has heard about Lucy?
Oh, it's not the first fossil in the human discovery.
Okay, it's a very important hominidid fossil that was discovered. It's a video that shows you how Lucy may have preserved. And if you were to guess, what would be the guess how she preserved this hominid? Where would have it preserved more easily? In water. So the idea is that she fell in water and she died. And then during the process of mineralization in water, with all the sediments covering her, she was preserved. And then we have found it actually in 1974, I believe, and it was a very important discovery. We'll talk about Lucy more when we talk about hominidid evolution.
It takes a rare set of circumstances to turn a living creature into fossilized bone. In the case of Lucy, the famous hominid fossil, discovered in Ethiopia's Great Rift Valley in 1974, there is no evidence that she met a violent death. No predator or scavenger found her body before it began rotting in the lake's soft sediments. Her bones, which settled in the mud, may have been cracked or shattered by animals roaming around the shore. Heavy rains gradually washed in enough sand and gravel to bury her bones. These deposits built up over thousands of years, burying her remains hundreds of feet deep. The calcium in her bones, molecule by molecule, was replaced by minerals from these deposits, ultimately turning the bones to stone. She remained buried over millions of years, while the Earth's crust moved constantly, forcing the remains of her body closer to the surface. Heavy storms beating down on the Earth eroded the sediment, and most likely brought her once again to the Earth's surface. Her exposure made it possible for anthropologists to later discover her remains some 3 million years after her death.
Okay. Probably watch again this movie, this video whenever we talk about hominid evolution. And I'll tell you more about Lucy. Okay, so the next thing we have to talk about is how we date fossils, which doesn't mean we go out to dinner with fossils. It means, that was a joke, it means how we can say how old is a fossil. Okay, so there are two methodologies. One is known as relative dating. Relative dating doesn't really give you an exact number, but it gives you an idea of how old relative to other species or groups one fossil record could be. And the other one is the absolute dating. It gives you a quite precise number of how old a certain fossil can be. Okay, starting with the relative dating of fossils. I don't know how many of you catch in the video, at the very beginning of the whale evolution video. The paleontologist was talking about strata, was talking about layers of sediments that accumulate and they can kind of be dated as well. And the idea is that as the layers accumulate, of course, the ones that are on the bottom are the oldest layers, and the ones that are on top of a certain rock formation or sediment formation are the youngest. So if you have fossils that are, if you have organisms that have died in those layers, remember the layers form millions of years, of course, on the bottom you will have the organisms that are older, and in that succession on top you will have the ones that are younger. So that's the idea of relative dating, okay? And in this type of dating, of course, if you are an expert, you know you have to be careful because rock formations can be disturbed. Some rock formations are intact. They present themselves as the various layers forms. But there are phenomena that can disturb rock formations, such as faulting, where basically there's cracking and slipping apart, flipping upside down of some pieces of rocks, some rock formations, or erosion, where there is the original rock can move away from the original position, sometimes even in a water body, and be transported somewhere else. Okay, so obviously all these phenomena are taken into account by the experts when they do relative dating. And again, this will help us walk. So, generally speaking, if we are in front of a rock formation that is undisturbed, you can recognize a succession, okay, from the bottom to the top, oldest to youngest. And you can talk about a faunal succession. You can focus on animals, which will be your fauna, or sometimes people focus on plants. In that case, it will be a floral succession. Okay, so again, in this course, we focus on animals. All right, and in this, again, in this faunal succession, you can these are all species of trilobites, for instance, shown here. It tells you that this species or this group is older than the one that is on top. And to be really precise, when we talk about all these layers, we should use the Latin term for layer, which is stratum. So stratum is a layer, strata is a layers, it's the plural, okay? So you will read and hear about strata or stratum. And you will read about a faunal succession, meaning the vertical sequence from the bottom to the top of what you see in those rock formations. Now, the general rule of thumb is that when we observe a succession, a faunal succession, for instance, what we gather is that life becomes more complex. Organisms develop more complexity. Okay, that's always the rule that we observe. We'll talk about the Cambrian period very well in this course. Actually, not in this unit. Cambrian period, which is a period of time where basically, which happened about 500 million years ago, which is not very long time ago. We know that life on Earth, more or less, anybody remember if I told you when did it appear?
4 billion? 3 billion?
3 to 4 billions of years ago. And as we will learn, it's not until a few hundred millions of years ago there was an explosion of complexity, let's say. Life before the Cambrian period was boring, was just few organisms, even multicellularity was just beginning. And for the longest period of time, for billions of years, was that way. Now, how did it explode? Complexity all of a sudden? We will talk about that, okay? And there are some theories out there. We'll talk about all that. All right, so Sometimes we have the same rock formation in two different continents, and you know what is the explanation there, okay? Where we find the exact same succession. How can that happen? That was the same rock formation that was brought apart during the formation of continents. All right, so relative dating of fossil. Don't worry about this slide, okay? Starting next time, we'll talk about absolute dating of fossil. Can you guys do one little thing for me, one little homework thing? Just review the structure of an atom, okay? What an atom is made of. Atoms. So what are atoms made of? What are protons, neutrons, electrons? Because we'll talk about this a little bit next time, okay? And I cannot do a chapter of chemistry for you. So we're going to talk about radioactive isotopes. So we're going to talk about neutrons, all these subatomic particles. Just review briefly structure of atoms.
What page does the homework end that we should turn on
The last chapter is this one, what the rock said.
Okay.
There is a chapter that says what the rock said.
We do that chapter or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like a short summary.